for an ordinance. Well, Mr. Speaker, in the immortal words of Emile Zola, I accuse. Mr. Speaker, I accuse this government of failing to produce a meaningful budget and prudent estimate book for 2018-19. Mr. Speaker, I accuse this government of failing to meet basic standards of transparency and accountability in public finance. And Mr. Speaker, I accuse the Chief Minister of being the architect of this dismal state of affairs in respect of our public finances, and thus, Mr. Speaker, utterly failing in his duty as Minister of Finance. And Mr. Speaker, these accusations are not mere rhetoric, and I intend to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, each of those as being true. And Mr. Speaker, as Zola himself reasoned, and I quote, "My duty is to speak out. I do not wish to be an accomplice in this travesty," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the government set out quite clearly, in response to my motion in March earlier this year, that it was a pillar of GSLP policy not to have a finance bill presented at budget time. As a result, Mr. Speaker, nothing, absolutely nothing, that the Chief Minister said today as regard any budgetary measures or tax changes has any practical legal effect when he sat down. If we need any proof of this, Mr. Speaker, we've only to look at the Gazette number 4468, issued on the 24th of May 2018, in which, Mr. Speaker, 3 years of backdated budget measures were introduced in one go. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we in this House today do not have the ability to debate or vote on those budget measures, as all that is in fact before us is the appropriation bill. Mr. Speaker, if we had a proper finance bill, standing orders would allow for a reasonable recess to enable the opposition to digest the measures and prepare a considered response. Evidently, Mr. Speaker, the government has no interest in scrutiny by the opposition, and regrettably, there's not a great deal we can say about what he has announced today. But, Mr. Speaker, I will try and make some observations on what we have heard today from the Chief Minister. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, thankfully, I'm not a smoker, nor am I a great drinker. So the budget increases in terms of taxation in these areas is not something I will necessarily regret. The other measures that have been introduced by the Chief Minister, particularly in respect of intergroup losses, will no doubt be welcomed by the Gibraltar Society of Accountants, who I know were lobbying quite hard on this point. And anything that we can do, Mr. Speaker, to enable the operations of business in Gibraltar to be effective and efficient should be welcomed. I must admit, Mr. Speaker, I'm a bit mystified by why the government is getting involved in the Damages Act and providing a savings bank product. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, I would like to hear more on this from the Chief Minister as to what the rationale is for the savings bank to get involved. My concern is, Mr. Speaker, that if they offer better rates than anybody else in the UK or in Gibraltar, that they will effectively be affecting the discount rate and, I stand to be corrected, be effectively allowing insurers to give lower payouts. But again, Mr. Speaker, I'd welcome the Chief Minister's thoughts on this matter and why there is a need for the savings bank to get involved at all. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is, of course, one positive for the ladies in the community, and that is the abolition of duty on handbags, if not somewhat discriminatory, because the rest of us poor gentlemen have no such tax perk. Now, Mr. Speaker, talking about tax perks, there isn't really much in the budget for the working family. I don't see much in terms of tax breaks or other measures that the ordinary working family will see a result in their pocket. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, in the public sector, the pay of 2.5% increase is in real terms actually zero. They will see no real increase because, as the Chief Minister said, in fact he said, inflation in 2018 was 2.6%, in which case they will have a negative real effect on their take-home pay packet. And Mr. Speaker, try as I must, I can't quite get my head around, and no doubt he will enlighten us, as to the cap on the 2.5% increase and the 60 pence per hour cap. This is something I would welcome more clarity on by the Chief Minister. What I was surprised to hear from the Chief Minister is about the 10% social insurance increase across the board. Now, Mr. Speaker, I did criticize the Chief Minister last year for not having mentioned this during budget time, and of course this year I do indeed welcome he has announced it as part of the budget and not in advance. But Mr. Speaker, this 10% increase in social insurance, if we are doing so well, and to quote him, as he knows I did quote him last year, when he was on the opposition benches in 2010, he said, and I quote, "If we are running surpluses, if we are in such good shape, tell us why it is then we need to further increase the cost of doing business in Gibraltar," which indeed he is. And Mr. Speaker, last year when he announced the increases in March, in fact the 10th of March 2017, the 10% increase which he announced effectively cost employers on average an extra £183.56 per annum per employee. And the employees took home £121.68 less on average per year. Those were last year's measures. This year, another 10% increase. What we will see, Mr. Speaker, is that the employer will be having to pay an extra £189.80 per annum per employee, and employees will be worse off by £143 on average each. So, Mr. Speaker, this is not really a budget for the working family. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, this is, perhaps as the government ominously predicted, a Brexit budget. But, Mr. Speaker, you cannot on the one hand say, oh, this is a Brexit budget, and then on the other hand boast it's never been so good, because the two just don't make sense. And Mr. Speaker, as I say, if we had more time, we would have a more detailed analysis on this budget. But then, to be honest, Mr. Speaker, there isn't much to analyze in the budget because there are not much in the way of measures. The only measure I can welcome is the capping of speculative profits on affordable housing, which I think we can all agree is something we would not wish to encourage. Mr. Speaker, other than the absence of a finance bill, this government has also slipped into the bad habit of taking the supplementary appropriation bill for prior years well after the budget debate. Not only is this illogical, Mr. Speaker, but it also has the effect of delaying the principal auditor's report, which we have still not had in respect of 2015-16. Mr. Speaker, if I may remind the House, this is what the Chief Minister said on the 2nd of March 2016. And I quote, "Because the main appropriation bills for the year are normally now debated in this House at around June or July of each year as part of the budget session, This has meant that the annual audited accounts for the previous year have necessarily been delayed until the approval of these supplementary appropriations, and the principal auditor has not been able to complete his audit of the annual public accounts until then. And he goes on. In order to enable the principal auditor to complete his audit of the annual audited accounts earlier, and for these annual accounts to be laid in the House on a more timely basis, the government has decided to revert to the earlier practice of presenting the supplementary appropriation bills separately. And Mr. Speaker, the supplementary appropriation bill for 14-15 was published on the 17th of December 2015 and debated in Parliament on the 2nd of March 16. The supplementary appropriation bill for 15-16 was published on the 22nd of December 2016. And Mr. Speaker, it wasn't debated in Parliament until the 6th of December 2017, almost a year later. Mr. Speaker, the supplementary appropriation bill for 16-17 was published on the 12th of January 2018, and we have yet to debate it in this House. It is evident, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister cares little for the budgetary process and parliamentary scrutiny. And I can only assume that he just wants to delay the publication of the Principal Auditor's report as much as possible, because, Mr. Speaker, Brexit cannot be an excuse for everything. Mr. Speaker, turning to the estimates book and the appropriation bill itself. My colleagues will speak in detail as regards their respective areas. But I have noted a general trend which is worthy of comment, and in fact has been picked up by the Chamber of Commerce in their annual report. Mr. Speaker, total recurrent revenue peaked at 655.7 million in March 2017. And we now see the outturn for March 2018 to be lower at 635 million. And yet, recurrent expenditure as a proportion of revenue, and again I say, as a proportion of revenue, is growing from 88% in 2017 to 94% in 2018. Mr. Speaker, in the estimates for 2019 to 96%. As Mr. Bossano, so the Honourable Sir Joe Bossano quite rightly pointed out, this is just not sustainable. Mr. Speaker, this is a worrying trend that does not allow for much of a buffer should government revenue suffer a downturn next year because of Brexit or any other reason. And Mr. Speaker, in those percentages, I have included the 25 million that is appropriated to finance government companies and which the government include in the calculation of what they call a surplus. But more on that later, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and this is in spite of stealth increases in fees from everything from MOTs, business licenses, fines, dog licenses, zonal parking permits, housing rentals. And Mr. Speaker, today we see an advert in the Chronicle for a 3% increase in rates across the board for residential dwellings. Stealth taxes, Mr. Speaker. Of concern, Mr. Speaker, and the real concern is a projected decrease in the cash reserves of the government from 127.6 million in 2017 to 96.1 million in 2019. And Mr. Speaker, there would then be a consequential increase in net debt in 2019 to 339.9 million, which is wide of the government's manifesto target of 300 million net debt by 2020. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it's surprising that in answer to my question 410 of 2008, the government stated that as at the 28th of February 2018, it had 260.4 million deposited in the savings bank. and which I assume, Mr. Speaker, includes government-owned company cash. And yet, Mr. Speaker, per the estimates, Appendix L, as at the 31st of March 2018, this was expected to be only 164.6 million. I really would be grateful, Mr. Speaker, if the Chief Minister could explain where 95.8 million has disappeared to in just 1 month. Mr. Speaker, it's frightening that from a balance of 308 million on the 31st of March 2017, it is anticipated that by the 31st of March 2019, only 127 million of the famous cash pool will be deposited by the government in the savings bank. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister may well reply, yes, but the money is somewhere else. Well, Mr. Speaker, every session I ask for the government's liquid reserves and holdings. I am refused this information. I ask this question every time I come to this Parliament, and I am refused the information. Mr. Speaker, what we are seeing, rather ominously, is rising recurrent expenditure, rising net debt, decreasing revenue, and decreasing cash balances. Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid to say this, but it would seem we're heading for a sober reckoning with financial reality, and we need to wake up to this now. Mr. Speaker, none of this bodes well, but it gets worse, I'm afraid. For the first time since I've been in this House, the government is actually anticipating what I would call a budget deficit, in that the closing consolidated fund reserve is lower than the opening balance. The outturn for March 2018, rather than a surplus, as the Chief Minister proudly announced, is actually showing a deficit of 4.9 million, which is mainly due to an extra £21 million required for the Improvement and Development Fund, which, Mr. Speaker, in itself is recording a 7.6 million deficit, and that is written deficit in their own book. Mr. Speaker, it's telling that the community care contribution for 2018 is not the usual 20 million as it has been for the last 2 years, but in fact has been cut by 25%. Yes, Mr. Speaker, by a quarter, to the lowest level under this government, to £15 million. Mr. Speaker, this is very significant in that it means that the government is actually now underfunding community care, whose annual cost in 2014, which are the last accounts I have available to me, was £16 million. Community care will, if the numbers have not changed significantly, and the Chief Minister kindly provided us today with some information as to the growth in eligible pensioners, which he stated in 2009 was 8,213, and in 2018 was 11,693. So I can't see that the community care's outgoings will be decreasing. So, Mr. Speaker, if the numbers have not changed, and in fact I would say the numbers probably have grown, community care will have to be eating into its reserves to fund its expenses. Now, Mr. Speaker, is this what the Honourable Father of the House meant in his New People editorial? That the government would be taking a contribution holiday to community care? And that community care would have to look after itself soon until its money ran out. Mr. Speaker, is it that it's starting to drizzle? And we really need to dip into the rainy day fund? Mr. Speaker, I was shocked to see for 2019, the government is actually projecting, again, what I call a budget deficit of £19 million. Without, Mr. Speaker, without taking into account its contribution to community care, even at its 2018 level of £15 million. Mr. Speaker, the government is, for the first time, actually projecting a depletion of our reserves. This is indeed, Mr. Speaker, a Brexit budget. But, Mr. Speaker, looking at the Improvement and Development Fund, the picture is not much better. In fact, it's much worse. The Improvement and Development Fund in 2018 is being emptied, such that from an opening balance of £7.9 million, is being left with nothing more than £319,000. Mr. Speaker, the fortunes of the Improvement and Development Fund, unfortunately, are not set to improve in 2019, with the balance only anticipated to grow by £108,000, which frankly, Mr. Speaker, is peanuts. Mr. Speaker, for me, it is the Improvements and Development Fund which has signed a death warrant for this budget if it needed one. And I don't need to bore this House with a colonial bookkeeper's technical analysis. I hear Mr. Speaker a member saying, I am. Well, I am proud to be one, but they are evidently not. It is simply this fact that makes this budget an utter nonsense, Mr. Speaker. This fact alone, which the people on the street will understand. Other than £1,000, yes, Mr. Speaker, £1,000, there is no, and I repeat, no provision for the cost of the construction of the 8 new schools which the government has already disclosed. Just the new comprehensives will cost £52.2 million. Nothing. If the other 6 schools are to be built at a conservative estimate, say, of 15 million each, then the total spend would be 142.2 million. Mr. Speaker, where is it in the book? Can the Chief Minister show me the page? Because I can't find it. It doesn't exist. It's not in the book. How can the Chief Minister stand up and have the temerity to say he's got record surpluses, but he's not even accounting for most of the expenditure? It's a nonsense. And Mr. Speaker, that's not bad enough. There is no provision for the 20 million wastewater treatment plant, again, other than £1,000. And he stood up this morning and said, well, we're going to be breaking ground before the end of the year. So where's the cost? £1,000? We know it's a £20 million contract. Can't he put in 20 million? Can't he put in 52 million? Oh no, Mr. Speaker, because then he wouldn't have a surplus. He'd have an even worse deficit. It's a nonsense. The one project, Mr. Speaker, that is recorded in the Improvement and Development Fund is the 2019 Island Games. And Mr. Speaker, I regret to say that, unsurprisingly, this is already significantly over budget. Over budget the 16.5 million, which is earmarked for it. And Mr. Speaker, I can carry on. There's nothing in respect to the National Theatre. There's nothing in respect to the Grand Parade car park scheme. Mr. Speaker, even if the government came back with a supplementary appropriation bill next year for this money, we simply do not have it in either the Consolidated Fund or the Improvement and Development Fund by the government's own estimates for 2019. We would be bankrupt, Mr. Speaker. We'd only have 96 million. How are we going to pay for all this? Where's the money going to come from? Mr. Speaker, is this what the Chief Minister calls careful calibration? It doesn't add up, Mr. Speaker. And the people of Gibraltar are rightly asking themselves, where is the money coming from, Mr. Speaker? Where is it coming from? And Mr. Speaker, the answer to this question, where is the money coming from, is simply this. The governments are running 2 sets of books, one public and the other one hidden and secret. The secret books of this government, Mr. Speaker, are a travesty to our public finance system, as I explained last year. We have absolutely no visibility as to what the financial position of government companies is, and importantly, what is happening to the 300 million by way of mortgage over 6 of our housing estates, which house thousands of families. Now, Mr. Speaker, today we hear from the Chief Minister, well, actually I spent 30 million of it on the Gibraltar International Bank. Well and good. That's the first we hear of it, and more on that later. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister gave a clue, perhaps, in the last session of the House, because, Mr. Speaker, that is what we seem to be working on. Clues, guesses, estimates, because we don't see the full picture. He said the government company had awarded the contract for schools and thus did not need to go through a procurement process for the awarding of the contract, to be precise. So, Mr. Speaker, I now have to guess that the new schools will be owned through a corporate structure that will enable the selling of parking spaces and other such commercial activity unheard of before in respect of our schools. Mr. Speaker, the evidence of our eyes tells us the money is being spent on schools, the university accommodation block, and the Midtown car park. But according to the government's financial records, and these, Mr. Speaker, are the official financial records, we're dreaming because they don't officially exist. When we ask for the cost of these mirages, we're told, no, Mr. Speaker, it's all commercially sensitive, we can't tell you, we're here to defend the interests of the taxpayer, you're all terrible, you shouldn't be asking these questions. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't wash. And Mr. Speaker, I haven't even touched upon the cost of the new affordable housing schemes. And funny enough, Mr. Speaker, neither has the Chief Minister. Perhaps because, by my own conservative estimate of 200 million, it is a dream too far, even for the Chief Minister, given the current state of our finances, as I've just set out. We are told, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister for Housing will have good news in this respect, but alas, I will not put too much stock in her words, especially when she said memorably in last year's budget speech as regards Bob Belisa Muse, and I quote, and this really is priceless, Mr. Speaker, there's been a delay due to technical reasons of infrastructure. Infrastructure is an important preliminary issue, and we wanted to get every detail right before making any further announcements. This is priceless, Mr. Speaker. This may affect the footprint of the new development to some extent, but not in a way that will be disadvantageous. I expect the technical advice and ministry process will be complete before the end of this year, and I'm delighted to announce we'll be in a position to have started the process of selling our new flats and give so many people the opportunity to be homeowners again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, fantastic phrase, technical reasons of infrastructure. Or could it be that it's going to be a school? So, Mr. Speaker, technical reasons of infrastructure really should now be taken to mean, much as, shortly on the lifetime of this Parliament, is there's going to be a complete change and nothing will be done on affordable housing. And Mr. Speaker, as regards the Minister for Housing accusation on Twitter that I'm a populist, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm a populist. If speaking the truth about the need for 3% rent rises for the next 30 years to pay for the 300 million mortgage on the 6 housing estates makes me a populist, then, Mr. Speaker, I will plead guilty. And, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister thinks me foolish if I make this remark, and I cannot therefore be very good at maths. Well, Mr. Speaker, I suggest he check with a technical expert who gave us that same information, one of which is sitting right behind him. That was information from his experts and not my guess, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this financial alchemy really has to end.
It's one of his.
We don't live in the Congo. The public deserves the truth and to know our true financial position for the Chief Minister. I have asked him publicly to...
Order. The honourable member is entitled to be heard without any comments across the floor.
I have asked him publicly to explain how the schools are being funded, and he sidesteps the issue. I've asked what's being done with the 300 million mortgage proceeds, and the Chief Minister talks nonsense about having a war chest and sovereign wealth funds. Mr. Speaker, he obviously has no concept of what these are, and he hopes nobody else does. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister either doesn't know the answers to these questions or simply cannot bring himself to tell the people the truth, which is, Mr. Speaker, quite simply and plainly, we are borrowing heavily to pay for his concept of utopia. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister said in a press release on the 26th of April 2018 that he will, and I quote, deliver substantial rainy day funds in excess of those ever held by Gibraltar before. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would really sincerely like to know where they are, because they're certainly not in the form of the Consolidated Fund or the Improvement and Development Fund. given that his own projections for 2019 don't show that. And Mr. Speaker, I really have to explode this fallacy that the Father House is promoting in that he has set aside substantial rainy day funds in other places. In the GSLP Liberal Manifesto for 2015, he sought to explain what, in his view, a rainy day fund was. And he said, and I quote, "It consisted in retaining reserves in a number of ring-fenced funds which were not available to the government to meet recurring running costs of public administration. The idea was and is that the rainy day fund should be available to meet additional funding requirements if there were unexpected calls on government expenditure or unpredictable drops in revenue." End quote. Mr. Speaker, the only true government rainy day fund that exists is, as its name suggests, the contingencies fund, created under Section 71 of the Constitution, which for a number of years has held a paltry sum of £400,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, this fund exists so that if there has, and I quote, "arisen an urgent and unforeseen need for expenditure for which no other provision exists, to make advances from that fund to meet that need," end quote. That, Mr. Speaker, sounds remarkably like the GSLP Liberal definition of a rainy day fund. But, Mr. Speaker, it is evidently not being funded. Mr. Speaker, the Father of the House likes to squirrel away money in different places, almost as if a burglar was going to break in one night in the Treasury and raid the government's coffers. Or perhaps, Mr. Speaker, he just does not trust any government, including his own, not to overspend.
The consultants.
Mr. Speaker, the surplus money held by community care is described as a rainy day fund in the GSLP Liberal Manifesto. However, it is a self-evident truth that is simply not available to the government to meet additional funding requirements. What it represents, Mr. Speaker, is a pot of money to pay pensioners should the government fail to meet its recurrent obligations. It's their rainy day fund, Mr. Speaker, not the government's. It cannot be accessed if there is a shortage in funding to meet healthcare, education, housing, or any other needs of the community, Mr. Speaker. In an editorial in the New People on the 17th of May 2018, called, I quote, "Clinton's community care nonsense," end quote, the following argument was put forward, and I quote, "Should Gibraltar be hit by a period of low revenue, pensioner income will be protected by the fact that the trustees have this rainy day fund available to them. By continuing to fund these payments to pensioners in times when the government might not wish or be able to fund the payments itself, the trustees of community care would be relieving the taxpayer of the need to make these payments. Hence the principal reason why the community care fund can properly be classed as a rainy day fund of the people of Gibraltar," end quote. Yes, Mr. Speaker, it is community care's rainy day fund if the government fails to meet its obligations. It cannot be and is not the government's rainy day fund, and to continue to describe it as such is utter nonsense. If the government were a company, it would not and could not claim its pension fund was its own money, unless it were Maxwell. Mr. Speaker, what we now see in this year's estimates book is the government's indeed running down its contribution to community care this year. And as I estimated last year, Mr. Speaker, I cannot see the government meeting its manifesto commitment of funding it to a tune of £230 million by 2019-20. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I am now concerned as to exactly where this £100 million already in community care is and how it is invested. I would rather see this large sum of money held and invested by the Financial Secretary, given the Brexit uncertainty we face. And Mr. Speaker, I take this very seriously. As I said in the House last session, I have complained to the Charities Commission in March of this year, but the last set of audited accounts filed by Community Care and its group of companies was for the 30th of March 2014. I have at the same time, Mr. Speaker, in March, with a chaser in April, written to the trustees requesting information on the investments held, but to date, as of today, other than an acknowledgement of receipt, I regret I have not had a response. Mr. Speaker, it is regrettable because an understanding on the investments held would, of course, have informed this debate as to the liquidity of surplus funds they hold, given that, Mr. Speaker, the drizzle seems to have started by this government, and the rainy day may indeed be soon upon them and us. I would therefore, I appeal, politely ask the trustees to please respond to my letter as soon as possible, as it is a matter, Mr. Speaker, of public interest where they're investing the 100 million they own. That money was gifted to them by this government. It is taxpayer funded. We are entitled to know what they're doing with it. And I'm also, Mr. Speaker, particularly interested to hear if they are funding any government or private sector real estate projects. If this money is held in bricks and mortar, it is not liquid. Or if it is liquid, I would like to know where it is. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, despite our best attempts in the last session, neither my honourable colleague Mr. Feetham nor myself were able to draw the file of the House as to whether this money was indeed or not deposited at the Gibraltar Savings Bank. We deserve an answer, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will grant that the reserves of the Savings Bank itself could be deemed a rainy day fund, as they are indeed available to the government. Mr. Speaker, the government's manifesto projected that the reserves of the Savings Bank will be 70 million by 2019-20. Mr. Speaker, given that its annual profits have been falling, this target will surely be missed, as reserves are projected to be only 41 million in 18-19, with an annual surplus of £4 million in 18-19. Mr. Speaker, the Savings Bank would have to make an extraordinary surplus profit of 30 million in 1920 or 2019-20 to meet the government's manifesto commitment. Mr. Speaker, it's going to have to miss this target by a large margin. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister said the GST government left Gibraltar with zero. That's not true, Mr. Speaker. When the GST left office in 2011, the government had £234 million in official reserves and a net direct debt of £285 million. Mr. Speaker, for 2019, this government's predicting official reserves of only 96 million and a net direct debt of 339.9 million. I'm sure we can all do the maths. Cash down, debt, net debt up. Is this what the Chief Minister calls substantial rainy day funds and that Gibraltar's finances will be stronger than ever before? Mr. Speaker, let's improve it, because I seriously don't see it. And Mr. Speaker, his own estimates book does not show it. And if it does, please tell me where it is, because we do not see it. Now, Mr. Speaker, on the subject of public debt, none is more contentious, perhaps, than the question of what is our real level of public debt. And it is indeed the perennial question that arises in these debates. But first of all, Mr. Speaker, I would ask GBC to correct the information on their website, where they say that net debt is down 1% to 324 million. I'm sure the Chief Minister will confirm that's not right. In fact, net debt is in fact up 2.8% from 2017 to 18, from 324 million to, from 315 million to 324 million. I think the reason for that, Mr. Speaker, is the rather roundabout way where the Chief Minister's compared our net debt figure to GDP, and that's where the confusion has arisen. But in real terms, Mr. Speaker, our net debt is not down. Our net debt is up. Up, Mr. Speaker. Up 2.8%. From 315 million to 324 million, Mr. Speaker. And on the subject of debentures and transfers from government to the savings bank, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have a quick extract from the Principal Auditor's report for 14-15, talking about deposits in the savings bank. And he says, Mr. Speaker, the increase of 274.2 million over the previous year is mainly a result of the issue of Gibraltar Savings Bank debentures, including, and I quote here, the replacement debentures for government of Gibraltar debentures that were redeemed early. So, Mr. Speaker, what Mr. Bolsano, the Honourable Sir Joe Bolsano, is referring to, there was a transfer, as my honourable colleague has referred to, a transfer of debt from the government's books to those books of the savings bank. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Chamber of Commerce has this year joined the debate. And they've simply asked this, and that is for the question to be settled, which I don't think is an unreasonable request. I certainly would welcome an external review from a specialised body, such as, for example, the UK Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, which is their speciality. Mr. Speaker, the official gross direct debt of the government of Gibraltar is £447.7 million, 323.8 million net as at the 31st of March 2018, which, Mr. Speaker, is made up of 247.7 million of debentures issued by the government but held by the savings bank, which I understand has no fixed maturity, and 200 million of bank borrowing. The bank borrowing, Mr. Speaker, from the last information available to me, is provided 15 million by NatWest, maturing in March 2020, and 150 million by Barclays, maturing in a tranche of 100 million in January 2019 and 50 million in June 2020. And Mr. Speaker, I note and hopeful as to what the Chief Minister said this morning about seeking extension of those maturities. Mr. Speaker, last year I tried to quantify indirect debt. And this year I've come up with the following. Credit finance, 400 million borrowed from the savings bank. GCP Investments Limited, slightly lower number now, 16 million borrowed from the Gibraltar International Bank, secured in government property. ES Limited, the proud owner of our generating station, 55 million Lombard PLC. Gibraltar Capital Assets Limited, 300 million loan notes secured in 6 housing estates. Mr. Speaker, that adds to the famous 771 million, in addition to the official gross debt of 447.7 million, which would take us, Mr. Speaker, to a gross debt of 1.218.7 million as at the 31st of March 2018. But, Mr. Speaker, this year, I need to add a new element, and that is in the form of the Gibraltar Development Corporation, who have, in fact, borrowed 30 million from government-owned companies in order to buy 30 million of B shares in the Gibraltar International Bank. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have no doubt that this injection of capital is needed and justified. It's the method of funding that I find unusual. Mr. Speaker, this morning the Chief Minister said that, well, this 30 million came from the 300 million borrowing. Well, that's the first we hear of it, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it begs the question, why were not the B shares paid for by the Improvement and Development Fund? Or, because there is in fact provision for it, there is actually the usual ubiquitous £1,000 allowance in the Improvement and Development Fund. Or is it, Mr. Speaker, that if the government did that, it would create an even bigger deficit in the consolidated fund and a higher net debt? If the government was perhaps concerned about increasing the deficit, if he wanted to be clever about it, he could have transferred 30 million from a savings bank's reserves to the consolidated fund to pay for it. But no, Mr. Speaker, that would of course mean the use of a rainy day fund, which would be difficult to explain politically and ruin the government's manifesto. So 30 million has come from the 300 million. We still don't know what happens to the other 270 million, and we still don't know. Chief Minister doesn't care, he won't tell us. But as the Honourable Leader of the Opposition pointed out, it's not his money, it's not my money, it's not our money, it's the people's money. And it's the people's debt, more importantly. So, Mr. Speaker, the solution is really quite simple. Get the GDC to borrow the money and buy the shares. Simple, no government debt, and the government keeps its rainy day fund. Wonderful. Mr. Speaker, this is the ultimate in financial trickery and reinforces my argument that our financial system and budget has been reduced to a farce, Mr. Speaker, by this government.
Here, here, here.
The Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Speaker, may be right in that the only way to resolve the famous debt question is to have an external review by experts. Because at the moment, Mr. Speaker, the government are fudging it. I now estimate our total gross figure to be at least 30 million higher at 1,248,000,000.7 million. And Mr. Speaker, what is worrying is that the government does not have a debt management plan to repay any of this debt, other than the Chief Minister making some nebulous comments on public television about half of the revenue of a certain product, which I don't think was particularly wise. The sinking fund, Mr. Speaker, barely increases each year. And we don't know how this 300 million is going to be paid back with the first payment due in 2031. The Chief Minister probably hopes to be well retired, driving around his electric car by then. Mr. Speaker, let us not be swayed by arguments that GDP has grown and thus our debt should be of no concern. The Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales recently published a report called The Debt of Nations. And they had to say this about debt-GDP ratios. And I think I'm going to quote, it's worth quoting. Although dividing debt into GDP is a common way to assess the scale of public debt, as a measure, it depends on the quality of statistical practices around the world. And I'm quoting here, GDP is not always reliable, may be incomplete, and can be subject to manipulation. Their words, Mr. Speaker, not mine. GDP is also not available to governments as a source of income. A better approach is to calculate public debt in proportion of the revenue that the government actually receive and use to service their debts. Mr. Speaker, that last argument is precisely why we had a legal debt limit linked to our revenue and not to GDP. But Mr. Speaker, this government abolished it because it didn't suit them. Come to think of it, Mr. Speaker, it's not entirely clear where the GDC got 30 million to buy the ordinary shares in credit finance back in 2014 either. Another mystery, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government likes nothing more than to create financial mysteries. And it hates transparency, Mr. Speaker. Something is said it would embrace in 2011. Well, I've seen no evidence of it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since December 2011, this government has created or acquired 37 companies. In answer to direct questions, the government has actually refused to explain the reason for the creation of some of these companies. Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable in a modern democracy. We don't have an elected dictatorship, or at least we shouldn't have. Perhaps we do. Credit Finance's financial information on the government's website still dates back, Mr. Speaker, to 2016. And Mr. Speaker, it still does not have audited financial statements. 6 years, Mr. Speaker, 6 years after its creation by this government. Not us, their government, on the 17th of February 2012. That, Mr. Speaker, to borrow a phrase from the Minister for Culture, is simply disgusting. And the suggestion that the information on credit finance has not been updated on its website, being due to the audit being completed shortly, where we heard that before, Mr. Speaker, shortly, is just not credible coming from this government. Shortly. Mr. Speaker, there's very little information available on government-owned companies. And Mr. Speaker, when there is, it is the bare minimum possible. I'm still waiting to hear from the Chief Minister for the full accounts of Gibraltar Capital Assets Limited, the company that borrowed the 300 million mortgage on the 6 housing estates. Mr. Speaker, as I made clear last session of Parliament, this is information that its own articles of incorporation require for it to be made public at Companies House. I've heard nothing other than an acknowledgement of receipt from the Chief Minister. Mr. Speaker, on the 300 million, again, we still don't know the terms of the option agreement by which loan note holders may sell their interest to government. And the government refuses to provide the opposition with a copy of the private placement memorandum setting out the terms of loan notes. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the loan note holders get more information than we do in this Parliament. And Mr. Speaker, for reasons I've already explained, we still don't have the latest report from the Principal Auditor. The accounts for the University of Gibraltar for the 31st of July 2017 are not finalised. And yet, Mr. Speaker, we're being asked to approve a tripling in its budget to 1.7 million in 2019. Mr. Speaker, a tripling. And we have no sight on their financial statements. And the Gibraltar International Bank has not yet filed its 31st of December 2017 financials, even though they have to be with the FSC by the end of April each year. And the government gave them 30 million extra capital. Mr. Speaker, from what the Chief Minister said this morning, it is evident that in 2017 they didn't make a profit, and that they are now in 2018 making a profit, which I welcome, Mr. Speaker. But what's the big mystery? Why this show of holding back information? Just publish it, same as any other entity has to. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the government still, and this is unbelievable, still hasn't gazetted the accounts of the Savings Bank, despite my repeated requests. And Mr. Speaker, it really is unfortunate that the 2017 statistical reports on tourism, unemployment, hotel occupancy, and other matters have only just been tabled this morning. This morning, Mr. Speaker. That doesn't really give the opposition any time for any deep analysis. Of course, Mr. Speaker, that's entirely what is intended, because the Chief Minister doesn't want us to analyse those numbers or hold him to account. And Mr. Speaker, I have to take issue with his explanation of some of the statistics. He talked about job creation, 956 jobs, more jobs created in the economy. Wonderful. But again, same as last year, Mr. Speaker, he fails to say that only 65 went to Gibraltarians. And that 720 went to Spaniards, i.e., Mr. Speaker, 75% of that growth did not go to Gibraltarians, it went to Spaniards. And he has the audacity to say, Mr. Speaker, that our people come first. Mr. Speaker, the creation of a responsibility for public sector efficiency under the Father of the House was indeed something that we welcomed at the time. And I thought the phrase that the Father of the House came up with earlier this afternoon, which is, I quote, work smarter, not harder, was perhaps something that the government should have emblazoned on every department, including the Chief Minister's own. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've seen very little evidence of success to date from the Department for Public Sector Efficiency. A simple example, Mr. Speaker, being the use of private sector office space. On the 31st of January 2017, the government entered into a 12-year lease, 12-year, Mr. Speaker, for 323 Main Street, at £100,000 per annum, which was originally, Mr. Speaker, to be used by the Savings Bank. Having then spent £216,222 on its refurbishment, and Mr. Speaker, we're talking about three floors. Today, it appears abandoned, boarded up and empty. Boarded up and empty, Mr. Speaker. And yet, Mr. Speaker, in the same period, we've seen the Statistics Office and the Audit Department relocated into the World Trade Center. Neither of these departments are public-facing. So we will spend a minimum of £1.4 million on 323 Main Street over 12 years, which is empty, Mr. Speaker, and move government departments into expensive office space in the World Trade Center. Mr. Speaker, this makes no economic sense whatsoever. None. The other particular failure is unfortunately, the budgetary control of the Gibraltar Health Authority. The Minister for Health assured this House in his budget speech last year, and regretfully I will remind him of it, I quote, "The GHA has ended the financial year with," and these are all his words, Mr. Speaker, "in my view, an unacceptable deficit. My commitment to our taxpayers is that in my first year as Minister for Health, the GHA will come within budget while improving healthcare." Mr. Speaker, again, the GHA will come within budget. Mr. Speaker, I regret to say the GHA is estimated to come in some £9.6 million over budget, Mr. Speaker. And this is despite him having, again I quote, and I was impressed when I heard this first, monthly meetings held on the first Friday a week after the close of the month with all heads of departments. We will review every single head expenditure line by line. If any subhead is in deficit, I will require full explanation for all the reasons and the steps being taken to ensure that the next month will reflect expenditure within budget. What went wrong, Mr. Speaker? I'm sure the Minister for Health will enlighten us when he gives his budget speech. But, Mr. Speaker, to be fair to the Minister for Health, it was my personal view that this last year's GHA budget was perhaps a tad unrealistic, despite the Minister's best efforts at budgetary control, for which I commend him. But, Mr. Speaker, not to disappoint this year is, of course, the Minister for Culture, who, Mr. Speaker, has yet to learn what a budget is. And he obviously needs lessons from the father of the house. Mr. Speaker, not content with exceeding his budget last year on the 2017 Music Festival by £1.6 million, which is bad enough as it was, this year, Mr. Speaker, he has beaten his own record. This is worthy of a Guinness Book of Records entry, perhaps even an Olympic medal. He's beaten his own record with an eye-watering excess, Mr. Speaker, over budget, which is already a loss, of £2.6 million. £2.6 million, Mr. Speaker. Yes, £2.6 million. More than half the annual running cost of GBC. That's for only 2 days of entertainment. What value for money? Evidently bringing MTV in 2018 didn't help much. Now, Mr. Speaker, I hope the Chief Secretary enjoys some success with his recently created A-team, comprised, I understand, of recently retired senior civil servants to keep an eye on departments and expenditure. I, of course, naturally welcome the announcement that the Chief Minister made of an external review of senior public sector salaries in Gibraltar, perhaps a measure that was long overdue. Mr. Speaker, and the Father House uses the term himself, value for money. That's what it's all about in the public sector, value for money. Value for money is about economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, which regretfully, Mr. Speaker, this government still needs to learn or simply doesn't yet understand, other than the Father of the House. Now, Mr. Speaker, I understand that attracting inwards investment is difficult, especially given the current Brexit environment. And I, for one, will not criticise the government for its failure to bring the Blue Water project into fruition. However, it would be nice to learn something about the new rock pile storage facility at Coaling Island, and of course what's going to happen to the Rook site. We've heard nothing at all, Mr. Speaker, from the Chief Minister as regards these two sites. And I would hope in his response he will enlighten the House. The father of the House, Mr. Speaker, is, although he's not here with us at the moment, is of course to be commended for his efforts in engaging with Chinese banks and construction groups and investors. I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that this does take time. I sincerely hope we will see positive results in years to come. And so, Mr. Speaker, if we may now turn to some of my other portfolios, being small business, telecoms, and heritage. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned last year, business licensing continues to be an issue needing simplification, especially with regards business premises requirement. Now, I know the Federation of Small Businesses and the Chamber are working closely with the government on this matter, and I hope progress will be made soon. The recently published consultation paper on key legislation affecting businesses and commerce is, of course, to be praised and welcomed. We need to reduce obstacles to business and provide encouragements, not disincentives to business, especially in startups. Mr. Speaker, the introduction of private sector pensions is something to be welcomed, and I look forward to hearing the views of both the unions and the Chamber and the Federation as to the best way to introduce these. I trust the government will come up with a workable bill after the end of the consultation period, and I look forward to the debate in due course. Mr. Speaker, the world of telecommunications has never been so competitive. And I really do now have a particular interest in Gib Telecom's financial performance. Not just because it is now part of my portfolio responsibilities, but also because the savings bank is its sole shareholder. And I note, Mr. Speaker, that Gib Telecom is doing its best to diversify its product range from fixed line to data storage and recently on-demand TV. I am, however, disappointed that its December 2016 audited financial statements are not yet available due, I understand, to technical accounting issues that its auditors, I am told, are resolving. Mr. Speaker, Gib Telecom's audited accounts are usually uploaded on their website promptly every year, and I look forward to them being finalized soon. But, Mr. Speaker, I am particularly interested in Gib Telecom's plans for the Haven site. This was purchased from the government in 2014 for £5.8 million, partly funded by way of a bank loan, and Mr. Speaker, it's been empty ever since. In 2015, an application was made to the DPC for a two-story extension to be built on the Haven site. But now, Mr. Speaker, this has been replaced in March 2018 with a new plan seeking just refurbishment of the existing structure and no extension. Mr. Speaker, no doubt the forthcoming annual report will shed light on its plans for the Haven and the associated costs, and I look forward to reading the 2016 annual report in due course. Mr. Speaker, last and not least, I welcome the publication of the long overdue Heritage and Antiquities Bill. I have already had the opportunity with my colleague, the Honourable Mr. Trevor Hammond, to have a constructive discussion on the bill with their Minister for Heritage. And, Mr. Speaker, in order not to anticipate anything that will be said in the forthcoming debate, I will leave it at that. We, of course, still have much to do on heritage, and I note the comments made by the Honourable Deputy Chief Minister as to the idea to enhance the Northern defences. But I also look forward to hearing more from the Minister for Heritage as to plans for the Moorish Castle. And so, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, as I said in my opening, I will not be a party to this travesty that the government calls a Brexit budget. Mr. Speaker, I accuse the government of failing to produce a meaningful budget and prudent estimate book for 2018-19. And so I have proven in that they have not included the cost of the new schools, and we can see reserves are being depleted. Mr. Speaker, I accused the government of failing to meet basic standards of transparency and accountability in public finance. And so I have proven. In that, Mr. Speaker, there's a lack of information given on government companies and indeed how the 300 billion mortgage money is being used and spent. And Mr. Speaker, I accuse the Chief Minister of being the architect of this dismal state of affairs in respect of our public finances, and thus, Mr. Speaker, utterly failing in his duty as Minister for Finance. And Mr. Speaker, so he must shoulder the responsibility. Him alone. Mr. Speaker, the people of Gibraltar deserve the truth and a meaningful budget. I will not vote for this budget, Mr. Speaker, not because of petty partisan politics, but because, Mr. Speaker, put simply, it is neither complete nor accurate. Mr. Speaker, the lights will not go out, the schools will not close, and people will not die, as the Chief Minister suggested last year, because of our voting against this budget. We have a duty, Mr. Speaker, to hold the government to account on behalf of the people of Gibraltar, and we will be negligent in that duty if we turn a blind eye to the Chief Minister's financial trickery. Trickery, Mr. Speaker. I stand by my accusations and will vote against this so-called Brexit budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.